You actually go outside in these things?
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Am I going to war or a circus?
What'd you expect? Black leather?
So which is it?
The comic book movie genre, or stories starring superhero and or comic book characters, since calling it a genre can be a little bit limiting. We hear announcements for new ones being made every single day, so much so that even mentioning a single one coming out at time of recording threatens to date this entire discussion. The idea of adapting a story from one medium to another is nothing new. In fact, I may have mentioned something about the very idea depending on the order in which my insane ramblings are relayed to you, my eager-eared listeners. From books to movies, games to theater, or in the case of today's discussion, comics to screen, no adaptation is ever going to be a true carbon copy of the original. That's just the very nature of the process. Though sometimes it seems that these changes are made not out of necessity, but almost out of, dare I say, embarrassment. As though the arbiters of these translations are ashamed of the medium in which their adaptation hails from. And I have dubbed this phenomenon comic book insecurity. So what is comic book insecurity? Why might it be afflicting so many stories we see year in, year out? And what are some examples, both new and old, that we can use as a litmus test to understand why this keeps occurring? And hopefully after we understand all this, we can encourage those undertaking these projects to take a bit of pride for the medium that the stories that they hope to introduce to a whole new audience were born from. So let's discuss. First things first, comic book insecurity isn't a new phenomenon. Looking back on the first ones of note, that being the Superman and Captain Marvel serials, these adaptations were for the most part pretty direct. They did what they could with their limited scope, and accomplished their goal of getting people interested in reading the comics. As well as, I'd argue more importantly, getting those characters into the public zeitgeist. To be honest, anything before the 60s, I'm just giving a pass to. Since, let's be honest, getting these things to look real and convincing now is already a project in and of itself, so back before everyone had access to computers, they did what they could. Animation, however, is a different story. Though here, most of the projects were pretty faithful due to the fact that the limitations were no longer restricted by pure reality. Animation also doesn't have to worry about getting these things to, look convincing and real. Most stories in this particular medium are just trying to look fun and engaging over photorealistic. It's for that reason we're mostly going to be discussing the live action depictions of superheroes rather than their animated counterparts. I also want to make it clear that this is not a discussion on comic book accuracy in its adaptations, but rather the confidence in which these people who are tasked with overseeing these adaptations approach the material they're working with. So this isn't a discussion about things like Superman's underwear being the right shade of red, or if they change how far apart Gotham and Metropolis are from each other. No, what we're going to be focusing on is one of the reasons why these changes are made to begin with, and when does it negatively affect the final results. Alright, now that we're all on the same page, the first one of these that I want to look into is Adam West and Burt Ward's 1966 Batman series. And this show is completely ridiculous and campy, but also a pretty faithful adaptation when you get down to it. Nearly every villain is ripped straight from the page. The sets and costumes are bright and colorful, and the dialogue is over the top and gets straight to the point.
As a duly deputized agent of the law, I place you under arrest for armed robbery.
Snap on the bat cuffs.
You've got me, Batman.
The show is an acid-fueled fever dream, the likes of which you're just not going to get anymore. But is also very indicative of the comic books being released around this time, at least back in the Silver Age. Batman stories would morph into that more dark and gritty crime drama you associate the character with come the 70s under writers like Denny O'Neil. But at the time in the 60s, both the show and accompanied film were pretty accurate to the era it was released in. The show was an unashamed translation from comics to screen. So while it itself does not suffer from comic book insecurity, I do believe that this is the first in the series that gave this approach to adaptations a bad rap. Because while today we recognize and respect the brave and bold translation the series took, fans back in the day had a different reaction. They thought it was making a mockery of the character they fell in love with. And unfortunately, the next big superhero DC would adapt wouldn't help buck this trend. In 1978, Superman the movie was released to theaters. And while it itself does not stray too far from its pulpy comic book roots, the follow-up films, particularly 3 and 4, would once again leave a bad taste in viewers' mouths by turning up the camp and lowering the production values. I wouldn't say this is exactly a problem of trying to be more accurate to comics. They weren't really adapting any characters. Surely not Richard Pryor in the third. But it still left viewers with that general comic book ick. And really, how can you not? Look at this. This is not the medium at its finest. But it did pave the way for DC's drastic change in tone with its next tentpole blockbuster. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the other side of the aisle with Marvel, since until recently, it's only really been these two that have been battling for our attention in regards to superhero stories being adapted. So in terms of films and television, Marvel wasn't really all that prominent during this era. In that time, they did release things like the 1970s Spider-Man starring the kid from The Sound of Music, Nicholas Hammond, where Spider-Man exclusively fought mobsters and a clone of himself.
That's right, Peter. I'm you, and you're me, and this is a gun.
A Captain America movie that saw him basically being indistinguishable from Evel Knievel, and this acid trip of a Doctor Strange interpretation. This one was actually pretty faithful to the comics. I do want to give a special mention to the Incredible Hulk TV series, which played no small part into the character's meteoric rise to popularity come the 21st century. So much so that even some small changes the series made to the character bled back over into the comics. The main one being the change they made to the character of Bruce Banner, or rather David Banner as the series called him. Yeah, the series creators thought that the character's name being Bruce wasn't masculine enough for a leading man, and thus changed it to David. But this would have a funny lasting effect that future movies would go on to have David Banner be either an alias or his father. There were also discussions had about turning the Hulk from his normal green to red, since red was more associated with the color of anger, but in the end they chose to keep him as the Jade Giant we know and love. The 80s were a pretty dry spell for Marvel, aside from this really accurate Howard the Duck movie, but though this did maintain comic book accuracy, a good movie it was not. Now the real movie I want to focus on from Marvel in this era is one whose aversion to comic book accuracy just truly baffles me. And this is the 1989 Punisher movie. Starring Dolph Lundgren in the titular role, this film was clearly aping off of movies like Death Wish and Dirty Harry, but never really coming together like those two did. A number of changes were made to this character, including having no military background, a completely different origin story seeing his family die in a car bomb rather than a crossfire between two gangs, none of his traditional supporting cast, living in a sewer, and the most insane to me, not having the skull on his t-shirt. I mean, come on, you couldn't even include that? I mean, I get getting cold feet over hokey characters like Ant-Man and Falcon, but the Punisher? That's about as straightforward as you can get. Nah, this is one of those bad movies, so I don't think we need to really spend too much time questioning the decisions they made. It's safe to assume they were all the wrong ones. But not to worry, because that year we also will be introduced to none other than Tim Burton's Batman. And this one, well, in terms of accuracy, it's kind of a mixed bag. There's a lot of inaccuracies you can point to in this adaptation. First and foremost, Batman himself being quite small. It's clear that they cast Michael Keaton due to his acting abilities and not his physical resemblance to the character from the comics, which that's what the filmmakers were banking on, considering he's supposed to have a secret identity. In addition to the casting, the Batsuit itself also saw its fair share of changes. No longer being a smooth, cloth-like texture, this Batsuit was armor with chiseled-in abs, and offered him about as much mobility as a gargoyle on the side of a building. Again, you can point to the limitations from the technology of the era. The poor man couldn't even move his neck, let alone get in and out of the Batmobile without a crane assist. But this all stems from the fact that those tights he normally wears just didn't fit for the mood they were going for. With the bad taste of the Adam West series still fresh in everyone's mouth, Tim Burton's goal was to make Batman scary. And scary he was, treating him more like a horror movie monster, and less like a friendly good Samaritan with a direct line to the commissioner's office. Batman would also be subject to what I consider to be a mortal sin on any Batman adaptation, that being the disregard for his no-killing rule. It's one thing to write a story that's a commentary on what if he broke his one rule, but it's another to remove it entirely. And don't give me that his original incarnation killed all the time. Clearly that was Hugo Strange in a Halloween costume. But if you wanted a direct down-and-out translation, Tim Burton was never the guy. He blatantly states that he's not exactly a fan of Batman, or comic books in general, and is much more interested in the world of Gotham, rather than the direct stories he's translating. But hey, at least his fascination with the city led to some gorgeous set design and scenery. I don't think any live-action rendition of this location has managed to be this ostentatious and iconic. Even today, Gotham is often depicted as a contemporary city, something like New York or Chicago. But this, yeah, I can believe that a place like this would spawn a vigilante like Batman. I think for the most part they got a lot of elements right, and the changes they made were because Tim Burton wanted to leave his mark, more so than being ashamed of the comic books he's working off of. Someone who I'll definitely never say has any shame when it comes to comic book adaptation and faithfulness is his successor, Joel Schumacher, with Batman Forever, and of course, Batman and Robin. Two films that I think should have had swapped names. I don't have any other place to put this. I just think it's so weird. Batman Forever introduces Robin, and Batman And Robin is the fourth one, so forever. How'd they miss that? It's not only Batman. Bad Boys for Life and Bad Boys Ride or Die also missed this opportunity. I mean, why does this keep happening, Hollywood? We're getting off topic here. The point is, Joel Schumacher had no shame when it came to adapting the sillier part of Batman's mythology. Willing to throw anything and everything at the wall, with neon colors, bright lights, and a clear love for the Silver Age. Say what you will about the quality of the films, but you gotta respect the craft. Unfortunately, its less than stellar reputation would leave a lasting mark. Ridiculed for being glorified Happy Meal commercials, many assumed that this would be the death of superheroes in film. However, not 1 year later, Marvel would get their act together and release the seminal 90s classic, Blade. Now, Blade is an interesting movie, because while I will say this is not comic book accurate in the slightest, the changes they made did nothing but help the story they were trying to tell. Ditching the green overcoat and yellow sunglasses for a more militant black leather, Kevlar jacket sort of look. They'd also go as far as to change his powers and origins, now not just being immune to vampire bites. Director Stephen Norrington instead made his Blade half vampire, possessing all the abilities while lacking their aversion to the sun, thus christening him as the Daywalker. And all in all, these changes were really well received. Now, the process of making him less ridiculous was already underway in the comics, but this movie finalized his transformation from the disco Van Helsing into the half-vampire badass that we love today. So this is one of those examples where the insecurities for the source material actually led to monumental changes that better serve the story and the character moving forward. But we can't just have good things now, can we? Because while these changes worked exceptionally well for the character of Blade, it also created the template for what Hollywood was considered to be the default way to bring these characters to live action. A dark, moody atmosphere, serious and grounded threats, and most notably, black leather costumes. Which leads us very nicely into our next Marvel adaptation, that being 2000's X-Men. Now, 2000's X-Men, directed by Bryan Singer, leads us nicely into the modern era of superhero storytelling. Now studios saw that there was really a buck to be made off of these stories. Thus, inflating the budgets and giving them a star-studded cast, superheroes would go on to dominate the next 20 plus years of filmmaking. With X-Men leading the charge, this team would not resemble the bombastic merry mutants from the comics, and instead they would take a more militant approach. With the popularity of things like the X-Files and the Matrix, the paranoia and thriller aspect of the X-Men was on full display, while pulling back on the more cartoony aspects like the costumes and overtly sci-fi elements like Sentinels. It also toned down powerhouses like Magneto, Jean Grey, Rogue, and Storm in order to put everyone on a more even playing field. In addition, the character of Wolverine would see a massive makeover. No longer being a 5'4" Canadian with an attitude, they'd cast all 6'2" of Hugh Jackman in order to have a more generic leading man take on the reluctant hero role. I guess comic book accurate short Wolverine just wasn't gonna make the cut. And yes, I know they made a joke of it in the Deadpool movie, but in that they really were trying to play up the humor. And if they really wanted to, I bet they could have made us take a guy with a shorter, stockier build seriously. But since they themselves don't take that aspect of Wolverine seriously, this is the result we get. And I don't want to put up a big fuss about this. I love Hugh Jackman in the role. But it just further serves to show the insecurity that this film has for the comic books it shares a name with. There's also this line that everyone's memed to death.
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
But the sentiment is true. Without the unique costumes, it makes it really difficult for these characters to stand out from one another. And the difficulty of seeing these iconic outfits making the jump from page to screen is one we'll be seeing a lot of as we continue this discussion. And this is compounded on by the fact that all their power signatures are removed. Characters no longer have that distinctive energy that flows off of them when they use their unique abilities. These are removed in favor of a more invisible ripple effect, along with heavy reliance on the sound design. Unfortunately, the result is just a less visually interesting display of what should be top-tier clashes of titans. The film's toned-down nature also severely limited the storytelling potential moving forward. The X-Men in the comics dealt with aliens, cyborgs, time travel, all of which were too out there for a series that had these kind of creative restraints. Follow-up films would try to attempt some of these, but always in the most grounded, least fantastical way possible. But with the success of the first X-Men, the message was sent to the rest of Hollywood. Tone down the more ridiculous aspects that come from the comics and stick to as straightforward and simple of approach as you can. Fortunately, not everyone elected to have these same restrictions, and thus you had a variety of projects like Daredevil, The Fantastic Four, and my personal favorite, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Craziest amongst all of them was the 2003 Hulk movie. This one is a delightfully strange adventure. Though I think director Ang Lee may have mistaken respecting and being enthusiastic for the source material with literally adopting the design language of comic book panels and using them to transition from scene to scene. Yeah, this particular type of direction was certainly a choice, but I mean, hey, they committed to the bit. Gotta give them that. I personally prefer Sam Raimi's approach, setting up each shot to look like a comic book panel, and using transitions where appropriate. But you gotta hand it to Marvel, at least they were putting stuff out. DC, on the other hand, much like the Avatar, completely vanished from this time period. Yeah, following the train wreck that was Batman and Robin, they took a long, hard look at where they were and where they wanted to be. But that introspective period gave them the time they needed to put together their big comeback to Hollywood filmmaking. And it would be none other than Halle Berry's Catwoman. Alright, not exactly hitting the ground running. But since this film shares about as much in common with the Catwoman from the comics as Neil deGrasse Tyson does with Mike Tyson, then I luckily don't need to give it any more attention. Which serves me well, because the next series of films we're going to be talking about is DC's actual return to form, that being the Christopher Nolan directed Dark Knight trilogy. And what more can I say about these films other than that they are immaculate? Triumph of the superhero narrative. Well, since there's a discussion about comic book films having an aversion to being too similar to the source material, I actually have quite a bit to say. Despite holding these films in high regard, they do have a really bad case of comic book insecurity, downplaying all the supernatural elements in favor of a more realistic, grounded tone. The first example is the character of Ra's al Ghul.
Mr. Ra's al Ghul?
Father's name was pronounced Raish, not Raz.
Ra's al Ghul.
So which is it?
No, hold on, I've already used that clip.
Which is it?
Yeah, I'll do. In this iteration, Raish or Raz or whatever he is no longer literally immortal. Instead, immortality is more of a metaphor, embodied via a mantle being passed down from master to apprentice. Further examples include the downplaying of costumed supercriminals, going for more of a domestic terrorist approach. Batman 2 will be subject to this reworking, dialing down the more eccentric abilities he possesses, like his genius-level intellect, or borderline superhuman strength, durability, and agility, with a more real-world man in an armored suit with a bunch of gadgets approach. All these changes are made with the ultimate goal of getting audiences to take Batman seriously. Christopher Nolan's entire conceit was he wanted people to believe that Batman could exist. They stripped him down to the bare essentials. A man waging a one-man war to save a city from its worst self. No magic, overtly sci-fi elements, or greater DC universe to speak of. And this makes sense. Christopher Nolan, much like Tim Burton, also admitted that he's not necessarily a massive fan of comic books in general. His goal is to make movies, not comic book movies. Personally, I don't see why there has to be a difference, but this is the path that most of Hollywood has chosen to go down. It's for reasons like this, as the franchise went on, the city became less fantastical and more akin to New York or Chicago, in an effort to further push that realistic aesthetic they were going for. So while again, I do love these films, they do kind of further the narrative that Hollywood doesn't really respect comic books as an art form, perpetuating the notion that the only way that anyone's going to take these things seriously is if heavy alterations are made in the adaptation process. So as you can see, comic book insecurity is something that's well baked into the makeup of these translations. Over the decades, writers and directors have struggled to find a way to make people believe that these characters exist in a world not too dissimilar from our own. And this has resulted in many changes and alterations being made, but where changes can be a good thing, when they're replaced with nothing of substance, this results in that insecurity being both on display and damaging the narrative that it's a part of. And you can change things for the better. Let's not get any pretenses that the comic books themselves are gospel. There are plenty of good and bad things that come from this medium. And as a storyteller, your job is to tell the best narrative you possibly can. This is why instances when you gotta work with things like Norman Osborn sleeping with Gwen Stacy or characters like the Black Bomber, not surviving the adaptation process is well and truly warranted. Not every idea is a winner.
What the hell is even that?
The entire concept of an adaptation is to grant a whole new lease on life to a story via a new medium. So when fans claim they want to see more authentic comic book storytelling, what they actually mean is they want to see the elements that they enjoyed brought over into this latest iteration. That's why it's so disappointing when those components that you were excited to see didn't make the cut, not because they weren't good to begin with, but because the people tasked with making these adaptations don't share their opinion, and therefore just elected not to include them. And that's what comic book insecurity is. A lack of confidence in the original stories that these characters were born from. But hey, at least it's a thing of the past, right? Because with the lucrative success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we have seen nothing but respect for even the most obscure of characters. So yeah, good job, Marvel. Comic book insecurity is finally dead. Oh yes, it's comic books we're dealing with, and nothing ever really stays dead. Unless if you're Uncle Ben. And if you ask Disney, he was never even alive.